Will you please pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. If you've been a long-time church attendee, you've probably heard tonight's gospel reading over and over. We especially teach one phrase from it to children in Sunday school as Jesus' golden rule, and we use it to talk about the mission of the church. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Or in tonight's reading, love others as much as you love yourself. When you've heard something often enough, long enough, though, it gets easy to think that there isn't any more to the text. I had heard this reading so many times that I couldn't get any perspective on it. I wasn't sure where to start in preparing my reflection on this passage. So, being someone who's really focused on language, I started with the words themselves, the translations as they've been passed down to us. In answer to the Pharisees' question of what is the greatest commandment, Jesus first answers, "You must love the Most High God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And then Jesus moves on to say, "And you shall love your neighbor as yourself." First, the word that we translate as love in Jesus' first statement is one of the three different Greek words for love in the New Testament. It's not romantic love, eros, or a sibling-type love, philos, that Jesus uses here, but it's agape, the kind of love that God loves us with. Deep, all-encompassing, active love. Jesus answers, when you love the Most High God, do so in the way that God loves you, deeply and actively. Speaking of Most High God, that's not what the original text says. It doesn't even say Lord, the way many churches and translations render this text. Instead of Most High God or Lord your God, Jesus says, love Yahweh your God. Jesus uses the personal name that God tells to Moses when God is present with him at the burning bush. There is an intimacy here that Most High or Lord miss out on, like Jesus is using God's first name, the first name that God revealed to Moses when they were face to face, so that Moses could pass it on to the rest of the community so that they too could know God intimately. So love the Most High God ends up sounding like, when you love God, who you know intimately, do so in the way that God, who is present with you, loves you. And how should we go about loving this God who we know intimately? Jesus tells us to do so with all our heart, all our soul, and all our mind. In saying this, Jesus is quoting from the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, except there, the word that gets used isn't mind, it's might. And not only that, but the Hebrew word that most often gets translated into English as might can also mean things more like substance or money. Love God with all of your wealth, all of your abundance. So now we have Jesus saying, when you love God, who you know intimately, do so in the way that God, who is present with you, loves you deeply and actively. Love God in that way, with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your wealth. And while you're at it, Jesus adds, love your neighbor with that same love we just talked about, the deep and active love of God. Jesus is saying, spread this same love, not just to God, not just to yourself, knowing that God loves you deeply and actively, but also to your neighbor. God loves them deeply and actively too, and so you should as well. Love God and yourself and your neighbor with your heart and soul and strength and mind and wealth. Okay, so now you are probably thinking, it's stewardship season, we've been talking about this already, and all of this translation nonsense is just a big lead up to get me to give to the church. Well, yes and no. I actually did not get asked to preach about stewardship season here, but I do know that we are in that season all the same, and my home church is in stewardship season as well. So I've been thinking a lot about what that means for me right now. Pretty much all I can share with you in terms of wisdom about stewardship is to talk through some of the same questions that I've been having as I think it through. As someone who has faithfully tithed for the last 5 years, but now is in seminary, I'm spending a lot of my time and talents on the work of the church and not bringing a whole lot of treasure into the house. I don't work full-time like I used to. I both want to support my church homes and I want to be sure that I can pay my rent through school. I both want to serve others in my work and in my giving, and to be sure that one does not eliminate the possibility of the other. And so what does it mean for me to love God with all that I have and to love my neighbor as myself in this moment of stewardship? Thankfully, I don't need to figure it out all on my own. I have a lot of models for this, but one of them in the early church we have in the reading tonight, in the letter from St. Paul to the church at Thessalonica. The letter to the church there is the earliest of Paul's writings that survives in the Bible, and therefore was written closest to the formation of Christian community in the wake of Jesus' death, about 20 years after Jesus was executed. This letter, combined with what I know about the early church, helps me to know what loving God and my neighbor and myself might look like. Paul and his disciples loved the church at Thessalonica so much that they not only shared the gospel with them, but also shared their own selves. We don't want money or glory, Paul writes. All we want is to care for you as much as God cares for us, as much as a mother cares for the babies she is nursing. And so we share with you both our good news and our own selves. In the early church, sharing the good news and sharing of our own selves looked like holding things in common, like giving up what you have and trusting that it will be used well in community. That's what it means to me to love God and my neighbor and myself with everything I have. It means that I have to know that what I have isn't mine to hold on to, but to trust that my community can hold it and use it better, and can hold me as well. Not strictly advocating that you give up everything that you have to this or any church, though you could and you would be in the tradition of plenty of Christians over history. What I am saying is this: let's, both of us, all of us, take a page from Paul's book and share some of ourselves in community. Not for gain, not for glory, but for the sake of the kind of love that Jesus calls us to. The kind of love that is radical. The kind of love that the empire does not want us to see, does not want us to give to one another, because it means that we are taking away from their power and authority and control. It's dangerous. It's the kind of love that got Jesus arrested by the state 2 days after the message from tonight's gospel. And it's the kind of love that can make a change. One of my friends shares that love by tithing not to her own church, but to a nearby Jewish synagogue. That's what it means for her to love her neighbor as her own self. She knows that her church is doing the work that she thinks is important and that benefits her, and she does a lot of giving in terms of her time and her talents to that church. But she knows that she doesn't know the fullness of God's love for humanity, and that by giving to other communities, she can admit that and help to share God's broad love. Another friend of mine shares this radical kind of love by giving to her home church well over 10% of her income and to other causes that she feels are important on top of that. She doesn't love her job, but she keeps doing it in part because it allows her to live and to give the way she wants to. So she does the things she loves on the side and as a result of doing this job, in order to give abundantly. And I am planning to share this radical kind of love by, even in the face of not making very much right now, continuing to tithe, to give a percentage of my income. The percentage of what is coming in, well, the percentage is the same, but what is coming in is much smaller than it once was. But I am still far more comfortable than many people, and far more comfortable than I know that I need to be. And so I'm going to continue to give out of this abundance. And I'm going to do something that I haven't done before. I'm going to split my tithe, giving half to my home church, which in the past has gotten nearly all of what I had to give. The other half, I'm going to choose month to month where to give it in order to embody this kind of radical love. Last month, it was to the LGBT Asylum Support Task Force, which I know this church knows the work of as well. This month, I will be giving to the Puerto Rico Hurricane Fund that my school is collecting for. Next month, perhaps to this church, which has given me so much support in the last few years. And I'll continue to figure it out from there. How to love radically with my money and my time and my gifts, with my heart and my soul and my mind and my strength and my wealth and my abundance. I will love in that way and trust that what I have is truly abundance to be shared instead of scarcity that I have to hold on to. And I encourage all of you to think about what it could mean for you in terms of this stewardship season and beyond. What does it mean to hear tonight's expanded gospel? And I'll say it one more time. When you love God, who you know intimately, love in the way that God, who is present with you, loves you deeply and actively. Love God in that way with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and with all your abundance. Spread that same love not just to God and not just to yourself, knowing that God loves you deeply and actively, but also to your neighbor, because God loves them deeply and actively too, and so should you. Love God and yourself and your neighbor with your heart, soul, strength, mind, and wealth. Amen.